The tender spoke. I have always wished for the Valkyrie's hand, as well as for her love. The Valkyrie spoke. The Valkyries are married to their steeds. You must gallop to grow wings, and you must grow wings if you would fly above the interweaving worlds of man, to watch lives without the passage of time, to see the paths of potential embodied at once. When you are able to carry a Valkyrie, then she will take you as her steed. Only then shall you truly be a son of her father. But to fly is to test, it is to carry our father's spear. That is for you the branch of the ash, that which remains from the fire to feed the soil, so that the ash may grow again the spear shafts within another season after death has taken his own. The tender spoke. I understood that your father had created the trust so as to isolate man's cruelty, so as to identify those that would be attracted. I understood that cruelty was in they that would be killed. I thought that was the reason the horde was gathered. The Valkyrie spoke. That is what he did, but it created a seed that should itself have never lived. Not all of the graduates died in the forest that day. The cure was not to outlive the disease, and yet it did, and from the cure the disease arose again, this time isolated, ingrained into a new tribe of man, that from its beginning would seek to do what we had done, but not so to eradicate, rather so to embrace the power that we ourselves knew to forsake. That tribe took for themselves what had been entrusted to their care. They clung to life, they feared death, they betrayed their king and queen. Thus they, when the old world had died away, and a new time arose for man, when man should have grown clean and strong, when there would be heroes enough that Valkyries would fill the skies, and all the world would embrace our father's love, they would forsake their father, they would be the bastard, he that grows without governing will, they would claim their father's cruel mantle, and rule as his supposed own. They arrived and by guile passed a blessed land, a land between a river and a sea, a land of warmth and plenty, where groves would grow to feed, the olive and the grape, and the blood of the bleating flock. And the tribes that grew abroad sent their scribes to travel, and witness the darkness growing, but did not fully understand, for they too were new in the again blossoming world. But they knew what they had learned, and so they protected the springs that fed them, and they sensed the defiling power. One by one they fell before that tribe until finally successful. Then the offending tribe was banished from the land that had sustained it, and so the tribe was set in servitude, so to learn. But that servitude was seen as slavery, and the tribe, true to its darkened blood, maintained its will, maintained its custom of requiring the flesh with the blood. They wanted it all, even where it would mean death. They saw themselves as slaves because they themselves had been the enslavers. They themselves carried the customs that our father had wished to expel. It was thought enough had been done, but their dark roots had reached deep, and their pride maintained what was hoped would be left behind. What our father used against the cruel, they used against all, and all saw the damage they did. Even the most powerful of neighboring tribes failed to quell their lust, and they returned to that land that they considered they owned, and only a new power, greater than any before, was able to take that land and hold it and attempt to wipe the slate clean. Even that was not enough, for the tribe's old stories remained wherever they were, regardless of the name of their land, regardless of that it had been taken and bequeathed to others to rule. None had managed to rid the garden of the deepest root of that invasive force. You were but one in a line of tenders. One of those arose from that very tribe, and so from within an attempt was made to do what those without had failed to accomplish. He isolated the root of the darkness within his own tribe, and exposed it for all to see. Still the tribe would not relent and conspired to have him killed. But his followers held and eventually took the mantle of power for themselves. And the dark tribe that lived off the blood of others, that were the seed of the notion of vampires, spread, hated and distrusted abroad. In small pockets they lived dispersed as the world grew around, as the tribes of the world consolidated into two against them. And to the extent those of the tribe would respect the customs of their hosts, they were allowed. But always their dark past arose, and the deep custom would seek voice, and their hosts would feel their blood running dry. They would see the cost, they would see the pallid, deadened complexion of once healthy brothers, and always they would know the cause, because none had forgotten that, in their own custom, there was a reason the drawing of another's blood was shunned. It was not the flesh that in truth was bargained for, it was the blood. The flesh would be maintained for as long as blood could be drawn from it. It was the blood that was bargained for, and no amount would ever satisfy the bargain that was made. Dead flesh drew no blood. It was growing flesh they coveted, so the promise was for the food that would grow the flesh, the means to feed, such that the blood would flow the more. The two that grew out of the many barred the feeding from the blood. It was not the way of the tribes that sired them. And so when those habits arose again, and were seen again, they would react. They could not stand by and only watch as their own were quietly ravaged, enticed, and then bled dry. But always there were those that were enticed, for men are men. And once man had grown away from those isolated springs that guided forebears, he was susceptible to forget. He could be drawn into misguided trust. He could be enticed by the potential for power, and this drive, it was seen, could be enticed towards conflicts for slights. Man would find himself weak. He would overlook the coordinated strength of what once might have held him, and instead he would turn to the promise of ease through the promise of wealth and gold. And as time passed, and where tribes weakened in their mixing, and where gold became the currency of trade above trust and brotherhood, and where the darkness existed long enough to weaken that brotherhood until it was sufficiently forgotten, then the blood drawn was taken from the community itself. Again and again the pattern would appear, and again on misplaced trust and friendship, if not kinship, communities of brothers and sisters would find themselves pallid, suffering, and ill, with a subtle sickness, and only then would the presence of vampire finally be noticed and responded to until flushed out and eradicated again. For 1,000 years and more this pattern remained, and always their hosts would be compliant upon promises, upon gestures of effacement, upon receipt of the humbled, for it is in the nature of my Father to facilitate the evolution of spirit, and thus it is in the nature of those that grew from his children to recognize the same. And thus the root was never eradicated, because the root existed in the soul of each, and though humbled for a time, it was inevitable that it would grow again, in time, once trust and security were again achieved, and memories had been made short. And the hoards that had been found and taken, distributed again, would be built again, always at first in a trickle, always hidden beneath, at first, an austere presentation, until strong enough that the palaces could be built again. And then the community outside, since bled dry, would see where their strength had gone. For every time they would in time be left with nothing, until death would take them in another's war. Their exile had been their punishment. They had squandered their right to land. The archangel had spoken and had banished the dragon from the garden that became its cave. He had set its offspring abroad, dispersed so as to learn. But even he had failed to weigh the scales themselves, and the hide had remained around those hardened hearts that had been born from the lust for more. The sin was not in the mother in the garden. The sin was in the son that turned on his twin, that gave birth to those offspring that would have the garden for their own. Men write their books to please themselves, to see the world in the light of their beliefs, their will to justify their own. This does not change, whether for the good or for the ill. Such is the importance of the seed, for the plant will always reflect the root of its seed. Thereby the stories pass, thus the young learn, thus the community grows into a thicket, and where allowed a spreading forest, a bloodthirsty thorn from which no orchard may grow. And so the many tribes became 3, and 2 of those grew from one, in response to one, to mirror between them the strength of the one, and all forgot the others subsumed along the way, all but those that remembered the raven. Man was becoming one again. Where man's power consolidated, there the greater prize was to be had, and so it was in the lands that rose from the power that grew to quell the dragon's pride that the dragon sought its hoard. And so the dragon endeared, humbled himself outwardly in supposed service to gain the trust again. And where undisciplined he failed and was banished for his greed, and where disciplined he succeeded and grew until his power, his quiet power, exceeded even that of those he supposedly served. He would make his kingdom again, first dispersed, quietly resented, but in practice employed by the worst in man that he himself had trained by subtle custom. Where disciplined he chose, to some extent, thus to share the wealth he gained. He traded strength for reliance, and once reliance was established, then the true weakness of the strength he allowed would be seen. For the reliant are always ultimately weak, such is the profound strength of custom. The dragon's spawn knew that power was in the story, and the strong had been made theirs, and all that came after was but addition, but addendum to a story they still controlled. The antidote to their own being was again converted to be the medium of their will, their God, my Father, the enforcer, who they mistook as the one they considered their own. They did not see that the traits they exhibited were the traits of a being set to contend against the very illness that they themselves embodied. They forgot what lay beyond. They forgot that the force my father served existed. They conflated the two and thereby became blind to all beyond. Thus they didn't see the context of the power they deemed themselves to serve. They applied the antidote such that the antidote, in absence of illness, became itself the cause of illness. Thus they became themselves the embodiment of the darkness that their traits had been designed to quell. And they were not alone in ignorance and misguided comprehension of cause, for the first of the two tribes that grew from that world failed, and thus laid itself bare to a latent susceptibility that would in time bring its own ruin. Only the second of the tribes that grew held true to its stern resolve and distrust. A son of my father was born to a daughter of the dragon tribe, and he, servant of this father, was stern in resolve and sought from within to correct its flaw by confronting its flaw at its heart. He entered the cave and confronted the dragon itself, required of the dragon that the hoard be distributed, that no more blood was to be drawn. But the dragon was resolute in will, jealous of the gold it had amassed, would not succumb, and so breathed his fire. That man was what he represented, and what he represented was sacrificed in favor of the dragon, and the promise of the gold he held, despite the cost of the blood he drew to achieve it. That was before the many had become three. That was in the time still of the many. Another tribe had grown strong in that time, a tribe of the old world, a tribe that remembered the many gods, a tribe that retained the love of man's true intended growth. The son of the dragon tribe was a son of the dragon tribe, though sired by my father as wanderer. And thus from his father he took his spirit, and from his mother he took his flesh. He thus saw the cruelty in his own, as well as loyalty to his own. Thus he could be seen as both stern and kind, for the flesh saw his own as subdued, and he wished to forgive while still recognizing the crime. And so to his offspring he became both deserving patriarch and gentle protector. The flesh resented the power of the tribe of the old world. That was their loyalty to their flesh. But the son of my father resented only that which was unjust in each. Thus he was seen wrongly as protector of the weak, for it was the weak that had let him die, that had allowed the dragon to breathe its fire upon him, manipulating even the tribe of the old world to its cause, by branding him a traitor to the order the tribe of the old world so valued. The tribe of the old world is called such as it was a tribe of the wolf, who had no need of gold in hoards. The wolf eats and then starves and then eats again, and thus remains lean and strong, steadfast in vitality of spirit. It was a tribe of Volsungs, spawned to carry the mantle of the best of man. It was the meeting of warrior and scribe, born out of the mind of the greatest of tenders, and by that stern discipline it grew. It subsumed and allowed all who would live according to the law it had rightly laid down. That wolf tribe was stern, and its sternness was cruel to all that resented its will, and its sternness held until the weak came to rule. But the weak were not truly weak. They were descendants of the dragon tribe, and they saw the advantage available. They smelled the blood that could be theirs. It was the blood of an old wolf that had ruled an empire of tribes. They were those that had stood against the dragon, that had themselves been the victim of the dragon, yet who had not been themselves willing to stand alone. So instead they had schemed to their advantage. If they could not get from the dragon, then they would feed and sing lullabies to the wolf, and when it finally slept, then its body would be theirs, not just the blood, but also the flesh.